Welcome to our final head and neck video. This one is on the cranial nerves. Before we go any further, I want you to pay attention to the cranial nerves chart on in your notes. The You don't have to remember most of the nuclei. The nucleus with the Edinger-Westphal nucleus is one of the few that you actually need to remember. So before we go any further, I want to remind you or tell you for the first time that motor pathways or efferent pathways are two neuron systems. So for the spinal nerves, like we saw in the upper extremity and back, for instance, the upper motor neurons are located in the cerebral cortex, and then they decuss, and the decussation happens in the medulla. In other words, it crosses from one side to the other. And then the next cell body is located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. Now, once it gets into the ventral horn of the spinal cord, the nerve fibers are then distributed by the dorsal or ventral rami. Now, cranial nerves still originate in the cerebral cortex, but then the lower motor neurons are located in the brainstem as opposed to the ventral horn. And from there, then it goes to they exit the brainstem to go to the targets as we've discussed. Now, with respect to the sensory pathways are in fact three motor neuron systems. For the spinal nerves, as we've talked about in the upper extremity, for instance, the first neuron is located in the dorsal root ganglion. And then from there, the second neuron is located in the dorsal horn, and then it projects onto a neuron in the thalamus that then projects onto the sensory cortex. Cranial nerves, however, the primary neural cell body is located outside of the CNS, and so from there it projects onto a secondary nucleus, a secondary sensory nuclei in the brainstem, and from there to the thalamus, and then again to the sensory cortex. Parasympathetics in the head and neck are drawn here with the trigeminal nerve. Remember that the trigeminal nerve distributes parasympathetics that originate in either cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, or 10. As you're learning it, it's easier for you to learn the trigeminal nerve first and its branches, and then layer on top of that the parasympathetics. By and large, though, those parasympathetics, they start with cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, go to one of those 4 parasympathetic ganglia in the head and neck, and then get distributed largely by branches of the trigeminal nerve in order to get to salivary glands, the lacrimal glands, nasal and pharyngeal glands, the sphincter muscle of the pupil, the ciliary muscles of the islands, and then they can descend, or I'm including these here, but remember cranial nerve 10, that's going to be distributed, that's going to be responsible for parasympathetics to the gut and thorax. Sympathetics still originate in the IMLCC, and then so T1 to L2, and then those those fibers then ascend to synapse, those preganglionic fibers then ascend to synapse in either the inferior, middle, or superior cervical ganglia. From there, postganglionic sympathetics then get distributed to targets at the pupil, inhibiting crying at the lacrimal gland, um, inhibiting the mucosa in the lateral nasal wall and in the oral cavity. Those get distributed to their targets via sympathetic plexes that surround the internal and external, the branches of the internal and external parotid artery. Now, I think that Dr. Barlow discussed with you already some fiber types, and I just want to take a moment to remind you of those here. And so the sympathetics and parasympathetics that we just talked about were GVE fibers, general visceral efferent fibers, and they're going to the smooth muscles of the iris, glands, those kinds of things, so GVE fibers. But you'll also see GVA fibers for taste and smell, SSA for auditory, vision, and the vestibular system, SVE fibers for the facial and laryngeal muscles, and then general somatic afferents and general somatic efferents, and GVA, general visceral afferents. And so those, I believe those fiber types are already familiar to you. We've been using those terms as we go along, and you do need to know which fiber types are going to be housed in which cranial nerves, or at least originate with each cranial nerve. One way to remember that is to use that Save Virginia, Save Vase mnemonic that is described in your notes. If you have trouble with that, let me know, let a TA know, and we'll be happy to walk you through it. So here is a summary of the cranial nerves, and this one is in your notes. I want you to go ahead on and draw an X on cranial nerve 1, this olfactory one, because often it's talking about it's talking about the second neuron in that sensory pathway as opposed to the first neuron. And so that information is imprecise, and that's why that has an X on it. So here's the olfactory tract that includes the olfactory bulb. And that picture that I just showed you on the previous slide has the olfactory bulb identified as cranial nerve 1. However, that is the second neuron as opposed to the first neuron. The first neuron originates in this these nerve cells project through the ethmoid bone, through the cribriform plate, and there's about 20 bundles of these nerve fibers that are cranial nerve 1. And so there's a little bit of imprecision in that previous picture, because cranial nerve 1 is really these 20 bundles that are going through the cribriform plate and then synapsing with the second neuron that's housed in the olfactory bulb. These are SVA fibers, special visceral afferent fibers that make up cranial nerve 1 here. The next one is not cranial nerve 2. What I'm showing you is the accessory nerve, and if you'll recognize, I've introduced most of these cranial nerve pathways to you as we were discussing them. And so this really kind of serves as a review to pull everything together again, make sure we didn't miss anything. So here is the spinal root of the accessory nerve. Notice that the accessory nerve then goes through the foramen magnum, which is here, and then exits the jugular foramen, where it then can innervate the sternocleidomastoid and then move through the posterior triangle to the trapezius. There was some inconsistency in the naming of, for instance, some of the nerves that innervate the pharynx, in that the here you see we're talking about the vagus nerve. The more caudal portions of the vagus nerve travel with the accessory nerve for a while as it exits the jugular foramen, and then those more caudal portions of the vagus nerve rejoin it as it then moves on to its target. And so we talked about that inconsistency, and we'll call that cranial nerve 10. And then sometimes you see it referred to as cranial nerve 11, and you'll see, and you now understand why that inconsistency exists amongst different texts. The hypoglossal nerve, that is GSE fibers. The hypoglossal nerve innervates the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue, with the exception of the palatoglossus. So hypoglossal nerve is shown in here in yellow. There are some C1 fibers, C1 and C2 fibers that ride up or ascend the path of the hypoglossal nerve to get to the meninges, but those are not GSE fibers that are a part of the hypoglossal nerve. Those are C1 fibers from the cervical plexus. Likewise, C1 and C2 fibers that descend with the hypoglossal nerve, the descendens hypoglossi, to form that superior root of the ansa cervicalis, which innervates those infrahyoids, with the exception of the thyrohyoid. And so the C1 fibers to the thyrohyoid are shown here, and geniohyoid, or the nerve to the geniohyoid, is also made up of C1 fibers. Next on our list is the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. Remember that it has 3 portions. It has V1, V2, and V3, so the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular divisions of the trigeminal nerve. All 3 divisions are sensory, and they have, therefore, some GSA fibers that are responsible for that sensory innervation. And then the 3rd division, the mandibular division, has SVE fibers that innervate our muscles of mastication, for example. And so those motor fibers that are these SVE fibers are only found in V3. You can see this trigeminal ganglia, also the semilunar ganglia, because it kind of has a moon shape. And then it is, here's V1, ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular division. You can, and we'll talk about each of these as we go along. I want you to also appreciate these 4 stars that I've drawn here. Those are parasympathetic ganglia that where the fibers that originate, nerve fibers, GVE, general visceral efferent, these are parasympathetic, preganglionic parasympathetic fibers extend or go to these 4 ganglia. There they synapse, and then postganglionic parasympathetics from 3, cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 9, and 7, then get distributed to their targets, again via the branches of the trigeminal nerve. In addition, The trigeminal nerve, as I told you, was responsible for SVE fibers that go to these muscles of mastication, for example, but also the anterior belly of the digastric, the mylohyoid, the tensor tympani, and the tensor veli palatini. And then sensory goes to the face and scalp. Remember the anterior face, where each of those divisions of the trigeminal nerve were responsible for sensory innervation. The conjunctiva of the eye, paranasal sinuses, tympanic membrane. And so remember that was a significant portion of the tympanic membrane, but also the external acoustic meatus that were innervated by the trigeminal nerve and the auriculotemporal nerve, which is that we talked about. All right, so then also the meninges of the anterior and middle cranial fossa are also sensory innervation to them are provided by the trigeminal nerve. So here again are those branches on the anterior face where V1 has the supraorbital and supratrochlear as well as the lacrimal and infratrochlear nerves and external nasal nerve that are branches off the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal. In V2, the infraorbital is shown here, but zygomatical-facial and zygomatical-temporal are also branches of V2. And then finally, coming off of V3, going to the anterior face, would be the auriculotemporal nerve, which you saw in the infratemporal fossa, coming out as you remove the mandible, and then the buccal nerve and the mental nerve, which comes out on the anterior surface through the mental foramen. Here's a closer look at V1, our ophthalmic division. Notice that it goes through the superior orbital fissure, and then it gives off this lacrimal nerve, which goes to the lacrimal gland. It's a sensory nerve. Remember, this is trigeminal. These are GSA fibers that provide sensory innervation. Parasympathetics, as I've told you before, originate with the facial nerve, go to the pterygopalatine ganglia, and then hop on branches of the trigeminal to get to the lacrimal gland to innervate crying. The frontal nerve is shown here. Notice that it splits into a supratrochlear and a supraorbital nerves. And then coming off of this last part, this nasociliary, hanging off there is the ciliary ganglia. That ciliary ganglia is one of our 4 parasympathetic COPS ganglia, where the short ciliary nerves then distribute parasympathetics to the ciliary muscles, and also eventually those parasympathetics make their way to the constrictor pupillae muscle. The nasociliary also gives off the long ciliary nerve, which distributes sympathetics that would act on the dilator pupillae muscle. The anterior and posterior ethmoids we talked about when we looked at the lateral nasal wall, where both the nerves go through foramina of the same name in order to innervate the superior aspect of the lateral nasal wall and the nasal septum. And then finally, there's an external nasal branch and an infratrochlear branch that come off of our nasociliary nerve. Again, I mixed that up. So let me just correct that. The ciliary, short ciliary nerves distribute parasympathetics from cranial nerve 3. I'm sorry, I misspoke. From cranial nerve 3, I think I misspoke. From cranial nerve 3 in order to get to the pupil And then the lacrimal nerve distributes parasympathetics from the pterygopalatine ganglia, which is sitting in the pterygopalatine fossa that we saw through the infratemporal fossa, in order to innervate crying. And then the sympathetics were those GVE fibers that were distributed by the long ciliary nerve in order to get to the pupil. So here is a superior approach. So when you do your eye dissection, this actually looks a lot like what your eye dissection will look like, where you go in through the anterior cranial fossa, chip away at the orbit in order to reveal the musculature of the eye. Here is the ophthalmic nerve. It goes through the superior orbital fissure and then gives off these branches as we've just discussed. Slightly deeper is where you will encounter the nasociliary nerve, and hanging off of that will be a tiny ciliary ganglia with these tiny little nerves projecting to the posterior aspect of the eye. The second division of the trigeminal nerve is the maxillary division. Again, these GSA fibers go to provide sensory innervation of the maxillary sinus, the upper teeth, the anterior face as appropriate. So that second division goes through the foramen rotundum, and then that way it enters into the pterygopalatine fossa. So hanging off of the maxillary nerve in that space is the pterygopalatine ganglia. The posterior superior alveolar branches come out of the pterygomaxillary fissure and go into the posterior superior alveolar foramen on the backside of the maxillary bone. In the pterygopalatine fossa, the infraorbital nerve continues through that infraorbital fissure and canal in order to give off the anterior and middle superior alveolar branches. Together, all three of these branches, posterior, middle, and anterior, provide sensory innervation around the maxillary sinus. So when you have a sinus infection, your face hurts, and that is sensed by those branches, the anterior, middle, and posterior superior alveolar nerves. Exit in the infraorbital foramen, you have an inferior palpebral, nasal, and superior labial branches of the infraorbital nerve. The zygomatic nerve and the zygomaticotemporal or zygomaticofacial are going to be involved in sensory around the temple, but also they distribute postganglionic parasympathetics from the pterygopalatine ganglia that originated with the facial nerve. So those facial nerve, preganglionic fibers from the facial nerve go to the pterygopalatine ganglia, synapse, and then those postganglionic fibers hop on the zygomaticotemporal, and then onto V1, particularly the lacrimal branch, to get to the lacrimal gland in order to innervate crying. And then here are some more pictures of what's going on from this maxillary branch or maxillary division of V2. Remember, you get the greater and lesser palatines going to the soft palate, hard palate, and also the nasopalatine, which goes through the incisive foramen. In addition to those other branches that I've already discussed with you. And then you have branches that will then go through the sphenopalatine foramen in order to get to the lateral nasal wall and nasal septum. So there are three potential pathways for parasympathetics that are from the facial nerve that go to the pterygopalatine ganglia. One is to hop on zygomatical temporal in order to hop on the lacrimal, which is V1, to get to the lacrimal gland. The second is to hop onto the infraorbital and then get distributed to the maxilla in the upper teeth via the infraorbital. The third pathway is to go via the greater and lesser palatine nerves to stimulate secretion of mucus from the greater palatine via riding along via the greater palatine and lesser palatine nerve. Remember, however, these branches of V2 are all sensory, and it's these parasympathetic fibers from the facial nerve, which are GVE fibers, that innervate these glands in the mucosa. The third division of trigeminal, the maxillary division, is both motor and sensory, SVE and GSA. The SVE fibers are drawn in black, and so you'll see that those branches to the muscles of mastication are shown here: masseteric, deep temporal, nerve to the lateral pterygoid, nerve to the medial pterygoid, but also the mylohyoid, nerve to the mylohyoid shown here. And so this maxillary nerve, as it goes through the foramen ovale, then distributes both those motor branches, those SVE branches, and these GSA, these sensory or afferent branches, the buccal branch to the cheek, lingual nerve, which is a mixed nerve, both motor and sensory. And then the mandibular, going through the mandibular foramen in the mandible, the inferior alveolar, which is sensory to those lower teeth. Finally, there's a meningeal branch, and then you see this split of the auriculotemporal nerve as the middle meningeal artery in the infratemporal fossa goes through it, ascends through it. And then the auriculotemporal eventually goes through this foramen spinosum. Also drawn on here is the chorda tympani, and that is a branch of the facial nerve. Remember, we saw the chorda tympani going through the middle ear on its way to get to the infratemporal fossa. That's the other place where you saw it. And then it joined the lingual nerve. So it carries, chorda tympani carries preganglionic parasympathetic fibers that are headed towards this submandibular ganglion. There, they synapse, and then postganglionic parasympathetic fibers then can go directly to the submandibular gland or hop back on the lingual nerve in order to get to the sublingual gland. The lingual nerve, so it does a few things, right? So it's a mixed nerve, but it distributes taste from the facial nerve, so taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. These are SVA fibers that are a part of the facial nerve via the chorda tympani. The lingual nerve distributes sensory. It carries sensory from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. These are GSA fibers that are part of the lingual nerve. And then finally, parasympathetics that originate with the facial nerve, these GVE fibers, are carried to the target or carried to the submandibular ganglia. From there, they then go to the submandibular gland or the sublingual gland. And then our auriculotemporal nerve, which is a sensory nerve, okay, GSA, it distributes parasympathetics from the otic ganglia. So these fibers, they originate with the glossopharyngeal nerve, go to the otic ganglia, synapse. The otic ganglia is hanging out here around the foramen ovale. They synapse, and then postganglionic parasympathetics get distributed to the parotid gland via this auriculotemporal nerve. All right, and so here, this is the facial nerve. So we've just finished talking about trigeminal. Trigeminal was responsible for distributing all these parasympathetics from facial, but also the facial nerve is doing a whole lot, right? So there are lots of fiber types inside that particular cranial nerve. Right here, we're talking about those special visceral efferent fibers. These are motor fibers that are going to innervate. You don't need to know this facial nucleus, but you do need to know that it goes through this. It goes through this geniculate ganglia. Geniculate, the root word there, genu, means to bend, right? But this is a sensory ganglia. We're talking about motor fibers, so they go straight through. They don't stop, and then they go to the stapedius, which we saw in the middle ear, which when it is innervated, it decreases the oscillations, the movement of the stapedius at the oval window. And then the facial nerve continues in the facial canal. Remember, we saw a bulge in the middle ear on the labyrinthian side, a bony bulge on the labyrinthian side, which was the facial canal, as this facial nerve was going through there. The facial nerve then exits the stylomastoid foramen in order to innervate the muscles of facial expression and the stylohyoid, the posterior belly of the digastric, and then a little bit of the, of course, the auricularis muscles, which are also a part of these muscles of facial expression. Remember, these muscles, they share a common innervation, they are a common embryological origin, as they are all innervated by the facial nerve. So here again is our facial nerve, and it goes through this geniculate ganglia, and then within the bone, in the middle ear, in the petrous part of the temporal bone, is this facial canal, and then it sends this tiny nerve to the stapedius, muscle, and then here's the chorda tympani going through the middle ear. It exits the petrotympanic fissure on its way to the infratemporal fossa, where you saw it join the lingual nerve in the infratemporal fossa. And then the facial nerve exits the stylomastoid foramen. All right, so these are, now I want to talk about the GVE fibers. And again, whenever you see these GVE, you should automatically start thinking about sympathetics and parasympathetics. You don't need to know this nucleus, but you do need to know that these facial nerve fibers go through the geniculate ganglia, and then through the chorda tympani, become the chorda tympani, and then hop on the lingual nerve where it encounters the submandibular ganglion. There, those cells synapse, and then postganglionic parasympathetics go to hop back on the lingual nerve to get to the sublingual gland, or they go directly to the submandibular ganglion. Alternatively, from the geniculate ganglia here, you have parasympathetic fibers, preganglionic parasympathetic fibers that ride in this greater petrosal nerve from the geniculate ganglia. And then this nerve changes names once the deep petrosal nerve joins it to the nerve of the pterygoid canal. I've colored that in dark green. Okay. Then from there, it encounters the pterygopalatine ganglia sitting in the pterygopalatine fossa. Those cells synapse, and then postganglionic parasympathetic fibers then go to the palate, the nasal glands, and the lacrimal gland, as we've discussed. So this image kind of shows you the same thing, but in a different presentation. So here's our nervus intermedius. That's our facial nerve before it gets to the genicular ganglia. Here's the genicular ganglia. And then we're still talking about the GVE fibers of the facial nerve, where they continue via the greater petrosal nerve to then that greater petrosal nerve then becomes the nerve of the pterygoid canal once the deep petrosal nerve joins it. It does all of that to get to the pterygopalatine ganglia, where those cells synapse, and then postganglionic parasympathetic fibers then can go on to try to get to the lacrimal gland, for instance. So one reason that the nerve of the pterygoid canal, the name changes from greater petrosal nerve to the nerve of the pterygoid canal, all of a sudden, the sympathetics that were accompanying this internal carotid plexus, they hop on the deep petrosal nerve, which is sympathetic, and then this nerve of the pterygoid canal then contains both parasympathetic, shown in yellow, and sympathetic nerve fibers. Now, those sympathetics do not synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglia. That is a parasympathetic ganglia. The sympathetic fibers just travel on through that ganglia in order to get to the ganglion to get to its target. And that's the same thing that I just told you. Okay, nerve of the pterygoid canal. Again, both sympathetics and parasympathetics are in the nerve of the pterygoid canal. Parasympathetics synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglia, but the sympathetics do not. Both then get distributed by branches of V2, which is the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. The facial nerve also has these GSA fibers that are a part of it. Remember that there was a small part of the concha of the pinna of the ear that was innervated by the facial nerve. And so that auricular branch of the facial nerve is here, and then it joins the facial nerve while it's in the facial canal. And then because this is sensory, these cell bodies are then located in the genicular ganglia. All right. The text, notice that the texts do vary on whether or not the facial sensory from the auricle joins the auricular branch of the vagus. So there's some inconsistency there, but it's shown here that these branches join the auricular branch of the vagus. The GVA fibers of the facial nerve are going to also have cell bodies located in the genicular ganglia. Sensory, specifically sensory at the palate, taste, I'm sorry. These are specifically taste fibers. SVA are taste. So these cell bodies are located in the genicular ganglia, and then they project onto the palate and the taste for the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So the anterior part of the palate and the taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The lingual nerve from our trigeminal nerve provided sensation for the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And then the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, both taste and sensation, are via the glossopharyngeal nerve. All right, so because of all the things that the facial nerve does, let's take a quick second to talk about the lesions of the facial nerve and the results of having those lesions in different places. So for instance, if our facial nerve is damaged at the internal acoustic meatus, then that will impact sensory, taste, to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. It will impact, the patient will have hyperacusis because of the inability to contract the stapedius muscle, which can decrease or dampen sounds. And then they will lose sensory to the concha of the ear, as well as the muscles of facial expression, which are innervated by the facial nerve. If the lesion is after the geniculate ganglia, so then the parasympathetic and sensory innervation conveyed via the greater petrosal nerve, the nerve of the pterygoid canal, to the nasal cavity will be unimpacted. However, everything downstream of that will be impacted, where hyperacusis, loss of taste, and Bell's palsy, right? So the loss of facial expression muscles will then result. The third lesion is of the facial nerve as it exits the stylomastoid foramen. Notice then only these muscles of facial expression and the stylohyoid, for instance, or a portion of the digastric muscle, only those will be impacted. But because the facial nerve was uninjured through the facial canal, the nerve to the stapedius, the chorda tympani, and sensory of the ear are all functioning correctly, as well as the nasal cavity and parasympathetics that result from that, as well as parasympathetics to the lacrimal gland for crying. If the chorda tympani is injured, it does matter whether or not it's injured before or after encountering the lingual nerve. If it's before the lingual nerve, then parasympathetics will be impacted to the sublingual gland and submandibular gland, as well as taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue will be impacted. But if it's here by the lingual nerve off of the maxillary, the mandibular division V3, right? If it's injured after it meets the lingual nerve, you'll also have sensation to the anterior 2/3 that'll be impaired in addition to taste. The glossopharyngeal nerve is cranial nerve 9. Notice that it has lots of different fiber types associated with it, and it exits the jugular foramen, and there is some inconsistency in your different textbooks where some people call the GVA to the root of the tongue and the superior part of the pharynx GVA or GSA, and so just know that there is a bit of inconsistency there. The parasympathetics, GVE fibers, come from the glossopharyngeal nerve, go to the otic ganglia, and then synapse there, and then postganglionic parasympathetics get distributed to the parotid gland. The glossopharyngeal nerve also, however, innervates the posterior 1/3 of the tongue for taste and sensation, taste and sensation to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, portions of the pharynx, as well as the epiglottis. All right, so here I'm showing you the SVE fibers associated with it. So coming from the nucleus ambiguous, these SVE fibers then go to innervate the stylopharyngeus muscle. Remember, we saw the stylopharyngeus muscle, and this is a posterior to anterior view, looking at the pharyngeal constrictors. When we expose them in the retropharyngeal space, right? And so here is our stylopharyngeus muscle. Remember, it allowed us to be able to distinguish our superior constrictor from our middle constrictor. And wrapping around the stylopharyngeus is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then there's a small branch of vagus. Remember, vagus does the innervation of this pharynx, and glossopharyngeal is responsible for a lot of the sensory, not exclusively, but a large part of the sensory innervation of the pharynx, internal pharynx. The SVE fibers, we talked about these going to the parotid gland. Well, how did they get there? Those preganglionic parasympathetic fibers traveled through the jugular foramen, through the tympanic canaliculus, and the tympanic plexus in the middle ear to get to the lesser petrosal nerve, and then get to the otic ganglia. So here is that again. So here's our glossopharyngeal nerve coming through the jugular foramen, and then it sends this tympanic branch through the tympanic canaliculus in order to participate in this tympanic plexus in the middle ear. What I like about this picture is that you can also see the sympathetics from the carotid plexus that then join the tympanic plexus, and then both can participate in or join in the plexus in the middle ear, but also to get to, via the lesser petrosal nerve, to the posterior pharynx, for instance. The GVA fibers, so sensory from the carotid sinus and carotid body, as well as sensory from the mucosa and of the pharynx, so sensory within the pharynx, the palate, the tongue. All of these are GVA fibers. The cell bodies are located in this inferior ganglia, which is before the glossopharyngeal nerve gets to the jugular foramen. And then they would then ascend into the brainstem. The GSA fibers, right, so general somatic afferent, these are going to go to the middle ear, eustachian tube or auditory tube, mastoid air cells, and then those fibers are going to go through the tympanic canaliculus in order to get to where their cell bodies are located in the superior ganglia, and then on to the brainstem. Glossopharyngeal has GVA and SVA fibers, so sensory and taste to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, epiglottis, and posterior part of the palate. All of that is the result of these GVA, SVA fibers, whose cell bodies are located in this inferior ganglia, inferior to the jugular foramen, but are part of the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then finally, we encounter vagus, which does the innervation of the pharynx and the larynx. And so The vagus sends a meningeal branch and an auricular branch participating in sensory in those areas. And then there's a sinus nerve, right, also participating at the carotid sinus. That is a place where those texts vary, the extent to which vagus contributes to that. Notice also there are pharyngeal branches that are innervating the pharyngeal constrictors, as well as this superior laryngeal branch, which branches into an internal laryngeal branch, which pierces the thyrohyoid membrane. And you've seen that with the superior laryngeal artery. And then an external laryngeal nerve, which goes to the cricothyroid muscle between the cricoid and thyroid cartilages, which is one of those extrinsic muscles of the larynx. The other branches you'll talk about more of vagus and their role in the heart, lung, and everything in the thorax and abdomen, but of significance is the recurrent laryngeal branch. Remember that the recurrent laryngeal changes names posterior to the cricoid cartilage to the inferior laryngeal, providing sensory below the vocal folds, as well as innervating the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. The internal laryngeal branch provided sensory above the vocal folds of the larynx. And that is it. That is all I have for you. We are done. Congratulations.